Chuck and Dave, are you guys ready to roll?
Yes.
Yes, we're here.
Excellent. Well, great to see both of you. It would be lovely to have the two of you here, but that pleasure will have to wait till a future meeting. Many of you will know Chuck Strozier very well indeed. He has participated in a number of our meetings and spoke particularly memorably about Gandhi. Chuck runs, amongst many other things that he does and has done, he runs a monthly book circle or book club. And I'm very privileged because although I'm on the other side of the Atlantic because of that, because it's something that happens on Zoom, it's possible for me to participate and to get the benefit of a number of other colleagues along with Chuck. One of them is Dave Terman. And I'm absolutely delighted that the two of them are joining us and are going to talk to us about something that, as I mentioned before the break, is really extremely frighteningly topical. Even again over the last few days, talked about a great deal, which is the danger, the potential nuclear dangers of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Chuck, David, thank you very much indeed for participating, and we hand over to you and look forward to what you have to say.
Thank you, John. I'm going to start. It's a real pleasure to see you and be with the Crick community again. And the presentation, as John mentioned, is jointly between me and my good friend and esteemed colleague, David Terman, who's a psychiatrist, psychoanalyst type, and was my teacher in the 1970s when I was a candidate at the Chicago Institute for Psychoanalysis. So we're going to switch off in a kind of tag team, like in wrestling, even though we're not in our Hulk Hogan costumes. And I hope you'll excuse my patch over my eye and my one-eyed appearance. The only comfort I take is that I live in Florida, where Ron DeSantis is governor, and Donald Trump lives in Mar-a-Lago. And in the country of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. So Putin has repeatedly threatened to use nuclear weapons from the very beginning of his war in Ukraine. We've not heard such threats for many years. They take us all into an unfamiliar political and psychological realm. The danger is not just large-scale destruction, but the absolute end of all life on Earth. The possibility of using nuclear weapons introduces into what is basically an old-fashioned ground war in Eastern Europe, the apocalyptic image of ultimate death of the world without renewal. I have to say that on the second day of the war, February 25th, I was walking on the beach and I kept thinking of von Stauffenberg. And that night I had a dream that I came up behind Putin and shot him in the back of his head. But even at a smaller and more tactical level, Russia's many threats pose great dangers. Keep in mind that small and tactical are relative concepts in this context, and would used in Ukraine would be the size of that used, a tactical weapon, nuclear weapon would be the size of that used in Hiroshima. If dropped on Kyiv, a city of 2.8 million people, at least before the war, the suffering would be enormous. Nuclear weapons also bring with them contamination of radiation that lasts into future generations, a danger vastly expanded by the fighting around Zaporizhia nuclear plant. The dread of radiation, furthermore, has assumed new meaning in the age of COVID. Both are tasteless, invisible, and yet kill. COVID amplifies the fear of radiation and feeds the new death anxiety that haunts the world. Putin has taken maximum advantage of nuclear threat. In fact, one could say he's already used nuclear threats by threatening to use them. He's already used nuclear weapons by threatening to use them. The West has provided palpable support for Ukraine, but necessarily stopped short of military response that would defeat Russian forces in their tracks. The dread is that actual defeat of the Russian forces would humiliate Putin personally. Backed into a corner, he could well unleash nuclear weapons. This is not an idle fear. In this presentation, Dave and I are specifically concerned with Putin's paranoia and its relationship to what the psychoanalyst Heinz Kohut called the group self. And I would just note that the idea of a group self, it's a psychological concept. It's not a sociological. Numbers have nothing to do with the group self. So that in Germany, for example, in the last free election, Hitler and the Nazis got 33.1% of the vote. After he became chancellor, we know what happened then. So, Dave, I'm going to switch over to Dave now.
Thanks, Chuck, and thank you, John, for inviting me to participate in this fascinating conference and fascinating group. I really appreciate it, and the wonders of Zoom make it possible to do so in the comfort of my study here outside of Chicago. So to carry on, then, my part of the team here, Putin's behavior fits logically into what appears to be an enactment of his personality structure that has always been formed by what we call the paranoid gestalt. Always grandiose to a fault, Putin appears in recent years to have surrounded himself by yes men who applaud his vision for a recovery of Russia's imagined greatness and feed his fantasies of American and Western conspiratorial intentions. He has throttled the press and cut off dissent, which limits the marketplace of alternative ideas. He is the new, quote, leader, the great one who alone possesses the ability to carve out an exalted history for Russia. He may also have been affected by the pandemic. He seems to have responded with fear and dread to COVID. Those huge tables at which he interviews foreign visitors and the extreme distance between him and his advisors suggest his need for an exaggerated isolation from potentially contaminated others. So death anxiety may have amplified his psychological distress. Where do these ideas come from, these crazy ideas? Well, in understanding Putin's worldview, Timothy Snyder, a noted Russian historian, has brought to our attention the significance of Ivan Ilyin, his thought and work. Ilyin was a white Russian emigre who obviously left the Soviet Union at the revolution and lived in Europe through I think, until the late 40s. And he wrote numerous books that specified a fascist political order in which Russia was seen as historically innocent and surrounded by evil. It was Russia's mission to safeguard civilization and the good by producing a great leader, with a capital L, who will save Russia and vanquish the evil other, that being the West. This framework clearly informs Putin's understanding of and reaction to the experience of Russia since the fall of the Soviet Union. Or he sees that fall as he sees Russia as caught up in an unrelenting and ongoing humiliation. It's terribly important. His read of history is that the West has gloated over the winning of the Cold War and then has successively plucked off many of the former Soviet republics as Western puppets. NATO reaches to the very border of Russia, and even more so now, and America arrogantly and intolerantly grabs world wealth. This discourse of aggrievement roams into wild fantasies of Russia's right to its imperial ambitions in Ukraine. We believe that profound humiliation that set in at the sudden loss of empire has aggravated the economic and social chaos of the 90s was an essential factor in the development of this ideology. In time, Russia recovered economically, but the humiliation lingered, and it became a deep wound for the populace that Putin has applied for his own political advantage. It also, as I will say, also is deeply resonant with his own psychology. He regards Ukraine as a fake state that historically remains an integral part of sacred Mother Russia. As Tatiana Stanovaya argued recently in the New York Times, Putin considers the Ukrainian language a mere dialect of Russian and imagines in the near future the Russification of Ukraine that would entail a purge of its elites, a dethroning of its national heroes, the renaming of its streets, and the rewriting of its history books. Putin lays out such ideas with an absolute certainty that is characteristic of the paranoid. Putin's demonization of the West connects with a deep, deep strain in Russian history. His grandiose vision for a great Russian civilization obliterates Ukrainian identity on the way to vanquishing the decadent and evil West. It is an open question whether such views really represent most conscious ideas of the Russians. In a psychological sense, though, it may not matter. Putin's vision perhaps speaks to an unconscious aspiration that are more difficult to document. Historically, Russians have been content to be ruled autocratically by such paranoid leaders as the empire, the Russian Empire, has indeed expanded steadily over the centuries, first under the czars and then under the communists. However, as we know, its power and prestige suddenly collapsed at the end of the Cold War with the breakup of the Soviet Union. Our concern is with the relationship between the paranoid certainty of Putin and his paranoid structure and the dangerous comfort he provides for the tormented and confused group self of Russia. Putin calls forth this imagined vision of a great past that is projected forward as a grandiose millennial dreams of future renewal. Putin's paranoid style of cognitive organization has occurred in response to the injuries to the pride, power, and ideals held by the group. His individual psychology responds perfectly to the sense of injury in the group that yearns in part for certain answers during chaos. His own injuries to his self-esteem matches the analogous injuries to the pride and honor of the group. That's an important factor, I think. The grievances of Putin and those of a troubled Russia in the last few decades became synergistic and generated rage. There is an interesting, again, an important symmetry between the individual and the group in this regard. The leader of the group who developed this cognitive organization, that is the paranoid gestalt, is usually paranoid. His, and most often such leaders are men, his individual development has been marked by childhood experiences of deep shame, humiliation, and often neglect. And there's a lot of data about that in Putin's case. Such treatment leaves him prone to boundless narcissistic rage and a need to see any failure as a weakness, any failure or weakness as the work of a malevolent other, not because of something intrinsic in themselves. It also results in a portion of himself that has an exaggerated normal grandiosity. That is, he is perfect and all-powerful. However, such a structure is very fragile and easily threatened with collapse and dissolution with the experience of failure, frustration, and defeat. When the group has analogous experiences, as we have described, it will often turn to a leader whose individual organization is symmetrical with that of the group. that is a paranoid leader. Hitler, Osama bin Laden, Stalin, Robespierre, Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, all of them in that category. The leader may then fashion the details of the cognitive structure of the group. Hitler gave the Germans the Jew as the evil other. Stalin gave the Russians the kulaks and the bourgeoisie. All the evil others that are designated as evil others have antecedents in the history and culture of the group, but their identification as the ones standing in the way of realizing the perfect state and requiring extermination is guided by the leader. Okay, Chuck, your turn.
So paranoia and millennialism, in other words, share a common psychological basis in what we've written about as the fundamentalist mindset. Too often, scholars think of fundamentalism as restricted to certain types of attitudes within religion. Fundamentalists are thus rigid and literal in their interpretation of sacred texts, insist on imposing traditional values, and hold absolute beliefs about the truth of their God, among other criteria. Our concern is to examine the phenomenon of fundamentalism psychologically and in the political and historical realm. Such a mindset involves thinking in rigid, among other things, thinking in rigid dualistic categories. A sense of the evil other lies at the heart of fundamentalism. The world is a dangerous place that is devoid of empathy. We are decidedly not all in it together. The evil can take a variety of forms to fit the historical moment. For Putin, the West embodies degradation, corruption, and lustful impulses that threaten traditional values, even though in holding these views, he's out of sync with many of his people yearning for the freedom that he disdains. Putin's belief is that his true Russia represents the good that must deal with evil. Such a Manichaean distinction reduces the struggle to a binary choice between his idealized view of good Russia versus the bad West that makes the choice radically oppositional. It is in the nature of the fundamentalist mindset to totalize the difference between good and evil. And totalism, as Robert J. Lifton has written, is the crucial psychological process of making something relatively manageable in the public space into great rivalries that spawn paranoia and violence that keep the hatreds burning bright. Rage becomes then chronic and ingrained. The other deemed evil in what emerges as a radical fundamentalist mindset comes to embody the taint of sin. That other must be dispensed with as a result. And in fact, his elimination assumes something of an ethical obligation to achieve in order to achieve perfection in the world. To kill, therefore, is to heal. And in this context, one could even say that killing makes one a savior. Violence becomes a moral imperative, lending what is typically an apocalyptic cause a profoundly important and powerful ethical dimension. The fundamentalist mindset requires an apocalyptic mission of the group. The perfect world will be reborn in this imagined future carried out by the select few. The remnant in the book of Revelation, the Nazis in Germany seeking their 1,000-year Reich, the true Muslims for ISIS, etc. The evil other must be exterminated in order to initiate the process of renewal. Endings initiate mystical new beginnings. Though unlike in religion, unlike in the religious imagination, after Armageddon, we don't get the return or the arrival of the Messiah, but nuclear weapons bring only a pointless apocalypse. Humiliation is at the heart of the intersection of paranoia and millennialism. The paranoid leader is exquisitely sensitive to what he experiences as an injury or humiliation. That attitude lies at the heart of the violent potentials within paranoia. In Putin's case, it seems to have motivated him to start a war without any provocation. The nature of Putin's apocalyptic vision and the war he has unleashed to realize it makes defeat unacceptable. It would represent massive humiliation. His fundamentalist worldview is so extreme that it doesn't allow for compromise. The very goodness of the world, of himself, and most of all of Russia are at stake. Defeat would shatter the foundations of his elaborate belief system, not to mention his self-structure. There's nothing more absolute for the fundamentalist leader than not retreating from the field of battle that has assumed apocalyptic meaning. Suicide is the only option, as Hitler came to feel, watching his dreams of the 1,000-year Reich evaporate. Putin has given himself a choice Hitler lacked. He need not accept defeat on the battlefield. This reversal contradicts the conventions of war long established in the West. Cornwallis admitted defeat when he found himself surrounded by Washington's army. Napoleon met his Waterloo. Robert E. Lee surrendered to U.S. Grant at Appomattox. The Japanese accepted the inevitable after America dropped 2 atomic bombs in August 1945. Surrender of defeated armies in the field has always been the nature of warfare, often reversing and undoing the apocalyptic fantasies of charismatic and paranoid leaders. Nuclear weapons radically changes that calculation. An awareness of the psychological vulnerabilities of Putin in the Ukraine war could help offer the possibility that he would actually use nuclear weapons. His aggression needs to be stopped, but Russia can't be humiliated or backed into a corner in the process. It may turn out to be a fine line. There may be hope, however, in the very grandiosity of Putin's imperial dreams. He imagines hegemony over a vast territory and influences on a geopolitical scale. Ukraine is only a piece of the larger vision. Perhaps diplomatic channels can find an off-ramp for him that will turn defeat in Ukraine into an acceptable loss. The larger issue, of course, is the presence of nuclear weapons in the world. Their very existence alters the meaning of war, indeed of violence itself. The kinds of familiar conflicts between nations, especially when millennial issues are woven into the fabric of ideological aspirations, assumes existential meanings. There's no simple answer to this dilemma. At the very least, as humans, we must recognize that the only rational and meaningful course of action is nuclear abolition. The famous clock of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists must have its hands turned back rather than continually move forward. Only then will hope and history rhyme. Thank you.
Dave, thank you very much indeed for a very thoughtful and thought-provoking analysis. I just wanted to make one comment because the concerns, as Nick Garvin rightly says, the analysis is persuasive and troubling. But I remember sitting here in another Oxford college at the time when David Trimble was elected the leader of the Ulster-Unionist Party. And David was known as a right-winger. He had come to be elected because of triumphalism in his behaviour with Ian Paisley. And I remember sitting there with a number of other people. I think it was a British-Irish Association meeting. And we felt there was this great pall of gloom descended over the whole meeting because you looked at this guy, we knew him from his background and so on, and we thought this This is a nightmare. This is just an absolute disaster. And it wasn't, you didn't even have to think through it, you just felt it. But of course, that is not actually how it turned out. And I suppose it maybe is important for us, even in contexts where it seems that we have arrived at the darkest hour, that things can emerge which we have not expected. Possibilities can arise which, if we think through them logically, it's just not going to happen. And I revert back really to Seamus Heaney's poem, and the fact that things can change. And as you referenced at the end, Chuck, hope and history can actually, on occasion, rhyme. It's important not to be hopelessly optimistic, but perhaps it's also important to retain some sense of optimism, even in these extremely difficult times. And of course, it may well be that they are dependent, these better outcomes, on the spirit of some individual or individuals who have the courage to stand up in our own part of the world, or even perhaps more particularly, as Dick Darwin was suggesting, in Russia itself. But with those words and words of appreciation, can I ask you to show your appreciation to Chuck and to